I'm at the Translational Research Conference for acute myeloid leukemia in beautiful Estoril, Portugal. It's been a really exciting meeting here, and I presented a talk on the clinical use of FLT3 inhibitors, which is actually an area that's evolving quickly. There have been 2 new drugs approved for this indication in the last couple of years. Midostaurin was approved in combination with intensive chemotherapy for patients who are fit for curative approaches, and more recently, gilteritinib actually approved by the EMA during the course of this meeting, and it had previously been approved in the US and Japan for relapsed and refractory patients with FLT3 mutations. These patients historically have done very poorly with chemotherapy approaches alone, and so they've really needed improved outcomes through advances in treatment. And previously, really all we had was the ability to escalate chemotherapy or do bone marrow transplant, and nothing targeted had been approved. So it's exciting to have new drugs, and the drugs actually do improve survival is the exciting thing. In particular, midostaurin improves the cure rate for newly diagnosed patients with AML and really is now a worldwide standard of care for patients getting curative treatment approaches. And in the relapsed refractory setting, really for the first time, there's a drug that's been approved that is a single agent oral, largely outpatient-based treatment of AML that has outperformed standard chemotherapy from a randomized phase 3 trial that I led that is not yet published, will be hopefully soon. The talk is centered on presenting the data behind that drug's development and how we're using those agents today. Moving forward, it's important to recognize that we don't know the relative merits of one FLT3 inhibitor versus the other in the same context, meaning that in frontline therapy, currently the standard is to use midostaurin, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the optimal FLT3 inhibitor for a number of reasons. Gilteritinib is more potent, it's more selective, and yet there are reasons to think that the broad kinase inhibition might actually be an advantage in the frontline setting. So a head-to-head trial comparing gilteritinib versus midostaurin, and similar trial comparing another FLT3 inhibitor, crenolanib, versus midostaurin. These trials are up and underway, and from these kinds of trials, we hope that we'll establish what are the best therapies. And lastly, I would mention that there's a third drug called quizartinib that's the most potent FLT3 inhibitor thus far that has gone through phase 3 development and also showed superior survival in the relapsed and refractory setting. That's not yet approved. Outside of Japan, it's approved in that country. It's undergoing regulatory evaluation in Europe, and a frontline study of quizartinib versus placebo has been completed in the context of intensive chemotherapy. We expect those results in about a year. So the field's moving rapidly, and I think if you come back to Estoril in a couple of years, I might have a very different landscape to present in terms of where we're using FLT3 inhibitors, but I think they're here to stay, and that's because they really do help patients in a substantive way.